Hi everybody and welcome back to Concatenations, a YouTube channel dedicated to music, literature, film, theatre and other art forms. This week I'm starting a series called An Album a Year, where I'll be taking an album from every year of modern popular music and talking about them. I'll try not to make conventional picks, because if you're on this channel, chances are you've probably got a base knowledge of what the consensus picks for some years are, and instead I'll try to introduce you to some new exciting records that you might not have heard or you've accidentally overlooked. I'm starting with the year 1960, but I'll now run quickly through some awesome records from the preceding years so as to cover my arse from people who think I should have started in the 50s and a couple of classical aficionados who may encounter this video. As far as classical music goes, I love Mozart's Requiem, Richard Wagner's Der Ring des Nibelungen, Bela Bartok's string quartets, and I can't really pick a favourite of those, Igor Stravinsky's Le Sacre du Printemps, Erik Satie's Socrates, George Gershwin's and Ferdinand Graffet's Rhapsody in Blue, and Ludwig van Beethoven's Eternal Symphony No. 9. From the 1950s, there's only really two I'd like to highlight, which are Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come and Duke Ellington's A Drum is a Woman. So for the first year of this series we go to 1960, which was perhaps the epicentre of jazz's evolution into freewheeling subgenres and a greater licence to experimentation. The aforementioned The Shape of Jazz to Come is often seen as the harbinger of that explosion, and I'd like to nominate the topic of today's video to be canonised alongside Coleman's work. We Insist, Max Roach's Freedom Now Suite by Max Roach. Now technically this should be billed as a collaborative effort between Roach and jazz singer Abbey Lincoln, who is a big name in the vocal jazz scene around the late 1950s and the 1960s. The album also features heavy contributions from Nigerian percussionist Babatunde Olatunji and veteran saxophonist Coleman Hawkins, who collaborated heavily with Thelonious Monk and has credits dating back to the vaudeville blues era of jazz. To begin speaking about this album, I'd like to make reference to the history of jazz music up to this point, albeit heavily abridged. For jazz, historical hindsight is paramount, not just for understanding the content of the music, but the evolution of the various movements which constitute the broader genre. I'd also like to credit the following journal articles here that I read to prepare for this video. Jazz's origins are African American, and many of the African American musical community became disillusioned with the standard swing sound by the 1950s, as the sound had started to become adopted and, if you will, overcome by white musicians. To the uninitiated viewer, this may sound like an unfair stance to take, but it's important to remember that at this time segregation was still rife in much of the US's southern states, and the idea of white musicians playing African American music in segregated clubs, sectioning and appropriating a cultural staple away from those who had actually invented it, feels like a tough pill to take. So by the end of the 40s, the predominant movement that leading jazz musicians dedicated themselves to was bebop, which required much more technical skill and for its time was a massive compositional step forward for the genre, with much more emphasis on highly proficient improvisation and much more abstract song structures. It may well have blossomed even as a reaction to the appropriation of jazz by white musicians by making music so difficult to play that it was near impossible to commercialise in the same way that swing was, where dances led by jazz bands were really popular. Bebop can be seen as modern jazz's genesis, with the movements which succeeded it, such as hard bop and post bop, becoming the blueprints for the boundary-pushing jazz we see today. Of course, experimentation within the genre became more and more common until we got records like Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come and eventually Max Roach's We Insist. 1960 was a crucial time in African American history, with the civil rights movement in full swing, but it was also a rallying point for another historical injustice facing the black community in apartheid South Africa. For those unaware, apartheid was a legally instituted set of racist policies and laws which existed from the early 1900s until as late as the 1990s. Under these laws, black South Africans were forcibly trapped in deprived areas dubbed by the government offensively as Bantu lands for the sole purpose of being easily exploited labour for South Africa's various white-owned industries, such as the jewellery and mining industries. They had little to no civil rights, encountered forced segregation from the white South African population, and were subject to arbitrary detention, harassment and physical abuse from the South African police force. Around the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s, the way this segregation was enforced was through the enactment of so-called pass laws, which heavily restricted the movement of black South Africans. In a protest at these laws outside a police station in the Transvaal region of South Africa, police fired on and murdered 249 unarmed protesters, in an event now known today as the Sharpeville Massacre. Armed resistance against apartheid through the ANC, or the African National Congress, led to Western governments condemning activists like Nelson Mandela as terrorists and prescribing the ANC a terrorist organisation until the 1990s. Now, with the British government now using prescription to silence debate over another blatant variation on apartheid by the Israeli government in Gaza and the West Bank, it's always important to highlight these historical parallels, that our government has historically used these terms to guide debate away from what is morally correct, and that standing up to that should be our duty as citizens. Back to the topic at hand, the struggle to topple apartheid in South Africa naturally dovetailed with the efforts to desegregate America and fight for equal civil rights for African Americans. Thus, there were several efforts to combine the movements into a wider front against white supremacy and the institutions which maintained it. From a musical history position, We Insist puts itself at the forefront of that connection. Its structure is key to this. The beginning song Driver Man begins in the America of slavery, portraying the caricature of white slave owners who regularly sexually assaulted their female slaves. The closer, Tears for Johannesburg, ends up back in Africa, a powerful pie-in to the victims of the Sharpeville massacre. The aforementioned song Driver Man takes the form of a traditional African American spiritual song, enlivened and modernised by the powerful performance of Coleman Hawkins, who finds a really sweet spot between the pain and overwhelming emotion of the piece, as well as the wry nature of the way the song is performed by the brilliant Abby Lincoln. The historical progression brings us to the song Freedom Day, which naturally explores the ecstasy of the end of bondage and emancipation. I noticed with this song in particular that there seems to be a hesitancy in the composition, as if it holds its breath, knowing that the struggle is not over. There's a section near the end where the band drops out and Roach is left to his own devices, and after oscillating between manic playing and a more reserved, sparse set of fills, the band, shaken but not yet deterred, joins back into soundtrack Lincoln's final verse, which espouses the naivety that emancipation meant African Americans were now legally equal to their white counterparts.
Free to vote and earn my pay, dim my past and hide away, but we made it Freedom Day.
Now the centrepiece of We Insist, as I might deem it, comes right in the middle, the overpowering triptych, prayer, protest, peace. It is absolutely unlike anything else that had come out at that time. It's a duet between Roach and Lincoln, without words but built around the shape of words. It creates an overwhelming sensation of anger, strife and helplessness. The peaks of Lincoln's screeching are accentuated and overdriven by Roach's pummeling playing. It is one of the first examples of what would later go on to become free jazz, and the finest example of the versatility of this record to soundtrack not just events, but the psychological effects of oppression on African American minds. Now, in an article by Robert K. McMichael, he discusses the struggle for African Americans in the 1960s to vie with white representations of jazz culture. He argues that despite the desegregation of jazz clubs, which could have led to cross-cultural and racial tensions being diffused, it often led to similar representations of black musicians, such as primitivism, being maintained, and that the general milieu of unequal race relations in America had not changed despite this. I believe Triptych is a direct manifestation of the struggle, because it is the real antithesis of what could be danced to or listened to casually. It is pure anger, storm of hatred and disillusionment that is meant to lay bare the pain that this injustice festers. Lincoln's performance on this is absolutely exceptional, one of the greatest vocal performances in jazz history if you ask me. In the way that Triptych works in the album is not unlike the role of the song Hare Krishna from Alice Coltrane's equally exceptional Universal Consciousness. Both revelations in each song shake the album to their cores, rupturing the structures by the strength of their convictions, and they're never quite the same afterwards. The second part of the album begins with the song All Africa, which features percussion accompaniments by Babatunde Olatunji. It seeks to platform the sanctity of both African music and the disparate tribes and cultures which led to the creation of this music, and thus combine the past with the present, preserving this lineage of African music which led to the evolution of jazz in the 20th century. Lincoln beautifully renders the origins of the music we're hearing.
They say it began with a chant and a hum and a black hand laid
and follows it by naming a variety of languages and groups such as the Zulu and Bantu of sub-Saharan Africa to the Yoruba and Bassa groups of West Africa. The second half of the song is Roach's ode to the power of percussion, going back to Lincoln's line about where and how this music came to fruition, with a wonderful polyrhythmic interaction between the four percussionists, Olatunji, Roach, Raymond Mantillo and Thomas Duval. I love the way the finale, Tears for Johannesburg, ends where Triptych leaves off. Lincoln begins with wordless shapes, wails which narrate horrors that words simply cannot, a sorrow that breaks borders and boundaries. But after this, the piece keeps going. It dips and it falls, it falters and rises, but it never stops its slow plodding towards some sort of justice, and the repeating bass line which thuds throughout the song mirrors the extended struggles of black South Africans for justice, mirroring the fight for civil rights over in the United States. For me, We Insist is a one-of-a-kind record, one that took political, historical and racial issues and confronted them head-on. It is rare, even taking the time it was released out of the equation, to find a record so rich in its persuasions and passions. Borrowing the term concept album is a little more accurate than describing it as operatic, as I would do to its nearest contemporary in substance and scope, Duke Ellington's A Drum as a Woman, but it really doesn't fully envelop what is a truly magnificent piece of art. Like the best music, it aspires to be more than music. It is designed to uplift a community, fight for justice, and do this by understanding its place in history and the role it needed to play. There are rarely albums better composed, more direct in their intentions, and more intellectually sharp than We Insist. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of An Album a Year, and I sincerely hope that my words have inspired you to check this record out, as well as any of the myriad albums I've mentioned along the way. Next up will be the year 1961, and if you have any predictions or recommendations of what the album might be, feel free to put them in the comments. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time.